let's crack open one of the most controversial books ever written, Karl Marx's Capital. But look, let's put politics aside for a minute. For our purposes today, we're going to treat this thing like a technical manual for a really weird, really powerful machine. So, according to Marx, capitalism isn't just some dry economic model. Nope. He sees it as this dynamic, self-moving machine, a machine that has its own kind of strange internal logic. And the weirdest part? The user manual itself seems to predict its own breakdown. So let's do it. Let's pop the hood and see how this thing really ticks. Okay, so any complex machine is built from basic parts, right? Well, for the capitalist machine, that basic part is the commodity. You know, just an everyday object. But when you look really close, things start to get weird. Marx actually calls it a queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties. So let's figure out what on earth he meant by that. I mean, just think about the last thing you bought. A coffee? A shirt? Your phone? On the surface, it's just a thing. But Marx says, hold on, it's actually living a double life. It has these two completely different natures. And if you can wrap your head around that split, you're on your way to understanding the entire system. So check it out. On one hand, you've got its use value. And this is super straightforward. A coat keeps you warm. A hammer bangs and nails. It's all about what the thing does, its physical properties, satisfying some need. Simple, right? But the second it hits the market, it suddenly gets this other identity, its exchange value. It's not just a coat anymore. Now it's a coat that's worth, 20 loaves of bread, or maybe 1/10 of a bike. It becomes this abstract number that you can compare to literally everything else. And right there, that's where the weird magic, or maybe the haunting, really starts. And this whole thing leads to what Marx famously called commodity fetishism. It's this idea that we start to believe value, the price tag, is just a natural part of the object, just like its color or its weight. We completely forget that the one thing all these wildly different items have in common is that a person, a human being, had to work to make them. So a social relationship between people, the folks who made the stuff, suddenly gets twisted into what Marx calls the fantastic form of a relation between things. And I love this quote about the table's wooden brain, because it just nails the point. As a plain old object, a table is just wood. But once it becomes a commodity, once it enters the market, it's like it starts to have these grotesque ideas of its own. Its value seems to magically appear from the market itself, not from the hard work of the person who actually built it. Okay, so if the commodity is the basic component of the machine, then what's its power source? Where does the profit, the fuel for this whole engine actually come from? Well, according to Marx, it's not a mystery. It comes from one very, very specific place, and the entire system is basically designed to suck as much of it out as possible. And that secret ingredient has a name: surplus value. It's basically the difference between the value a worker produces and what they get paid in wages. Now, this isn't just some clever markup. For Marx, this is the only place new value, and therefore profit, can even come from in the whole system. And this is where Marx's writing gets really gothic. He calls capital dead labor, the value that's already locked into machines and raw materials. And he says it can only come back to life by feeding on living labor. So the whole goal of the capitalist is to use that living labor to create new value, turning capital into this live monster that just grows and grows. And this is where it gets really clear. Let's break down an 8-hour workday. Maybe for the first 4 hours, the worker creates enough value to cover their own paycheck. That's what Marx calls necessary labor. But obviously, they don't get to just pack up and go home then. The next 4 hours they work, that's surplus labor. That's the part that creates value that goes straight into the capitalist's pocket as profit. So if you look at it this way, half of their entire day is, for all intents and purposes, unpaid. This leads to this crazy reversal of how we think things work. You probably think a worker uses a machine to make something. But from this perspective, the machine, the capital, actually exists to use the worker, to absorb their labor and pump out surplus value. The person becomes just another part of the machine, a component whose only job is to bring that dead labor back to life and make it grow. So we have our basic parts and we have our power source. Now let's look at the plumbing, the wiring of this whole thing. How does capital actually move through the system? Because it's not just about making stuff, it's about a constant looping circuit. The entire logic is right here in this simple formula: M, C, M prime. You start with money, you use it to buy commodities, that's labor, materials, all that stuff. and then you sell the brand new product for more money, M prime. The whole point of the game, the only reason this circuit exists, is to make sure that M prime is bigger than M. If it isn't, the whole machine just grinds to a halt. Now that circuit looks all neat and tidy on a slide, but in the real world, it is full of places where I can just break down. Every step is a gamble. You have to turn money into commodities, and then, and this is the crucial part, you have to turn those commodities back into more money. But what if you can't? Well, that's when you get stagnation. This is the machine getting jammed up. The factories might be humming along, churning out goods like crazy, but if those goods just sit in a warehouse and don't sell, the circuit is broken. The capital is literally trapped in its commodity form. It can't finish the trip back to becoming money again. And that stagnation is what leads to a full-blown crisis. What's so interesting in Marx's analysis in Volume 2 is that a crisis isn't always because people don't want to buy things. It's because the flow gets interrupted. Bills are due, loans have to be paid, but the people who own all those unsold goods don't have the cash. The big problem isn't a lack of desire. It's what Marx called a demand for payment that nobody can meet, and the whole system just seizes up. So it turns out crises are actually a feature of this machine, not a bug. But in Volume 3, Marx argues there's an even deeper, more fundamental design flaw, a fatal flaw, hardwired into its core logic, a self-destruct sequence that's always running in the background. All right, here we go. This is the big one, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. The logic goes something like this. To stay competitive, you have to constantly get more efficient, right? That means you're always investing in better technology, better machines. But what do these machines do? They replace workers. And this is the key. If you believe the theory that living labor is the one and only source of new profit, then you're literally, systematically replacing your only source of profit with machines. So over the long haul, your total investment skyrockets, but the profit you get from it doesn't keep up. The rate of profit gets squeezed. So how does the system even cope with this? Well, through crisis. A crisis is the machine's brutal reset button. It leads to what he calls sudden, forcible devaluations. Companies go bankrupt, investments get wiped out, prices plummet. This violently purges the system, clearing out the old junk so a new round of accumulation can start, one where profit rates are temporarily healthy again. So crises aren't mistakes. They're a necessary part of the cycle. We've now arrived at the last and, honestly, the most bizarre part of the whole machine. This is the point where the entire process gets so abstract that the real source of value just seems to vanish, leaving behind, well, just a ghost in the machine. Remember our old friend, the MCM prime circuit? Well, in the world of high finance, of interest-bearing capital, that whole middle part, the C, the messy, complicated business of production and actual labor, it just disappears from view. All you see is M becoming M prime. Money, all by itself, just magically seems to become more money. It's what Marx calls a meaningless abbreviation. And this, for Marx, is the ultimate illusion, the ultimate fetish. It's the point where capital seems to be this mysterious and self-creating source of interest. The connection to real work, to production, to any kind of human effort is totally invisible. He says it's as natural as a pear tree bearing pears. It just seems like money's natural state is to bear more money. This is the capital mystification in its most flagrant form. And so that brings us to the final lingering question. After going through this entire wild user manual, from haunted commodities all the way to money that seems to breed by itself, you just have to ask, if this whole thing is a machine, who's actually in the driver's seat? And the unsettling answer that Marx's analysis points to is, well, maybe nobody is. The system just follows its own relentless internal logic. Accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. It becomes a machine that isn't running for the benefit of anyone really, just for its own endless continuation. A machine that, in the end, eats itself.